Okay. Alrighty. Oh, so glad it's Friday. All right. So let's get started here. Update on your midterm. I'm still working on it. I was hoping to get more done yesterday. And despite having gotten up at 5:30 in the morning with this dreadful sensation that I had a bunch of work to do, and then working, basically until 5 at night, I did not quite get as much done as I wanted to, which is unfortunate. But other things were accomplished that now clear the way for me to finish marking your midterm. So hopefully this weekend, maybe I'm hoping to get it done this weekend for you. I'll see if I get any time to work on it today. I will do my best. And, hopefully my goal was a week. I have failed myself. My goal was probably unrealistic to begin with, but I'll have it done for you very soon. Okay, so we were talking about theories of secularization last time. We defined secularization, and particularly the inherited model of secularization, which finds its kind of ethos in linking modernity, right? This idea, the modern world, especially what happens after the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, of urbanization, pluralism, scientific rationalism, really driving down. The theory is that as modernity expands, right, and people get deeper into modernity, much of what made religion will disappear and therefore will no longer be needed. So differentiation was the other big one, right? That as institutions moved away from being controlled by religious institutions, right? The schools, the hospitals, and all that jazz were no longer controlled by religious institutions, that, people wouldn't need to be religious as much. And so the deeper you get into modernity, the less religion there should be. Okay, now obviously, some of the more forward predictions about the end of religion didn't come true. So secularization theorists were sort of left with a problem. Either revise the theory, abandon the theory, or figure out some way to adapt, the classical or inherited model of secularization to the new reality. And so we stepped into, my friend and yours, I'm sure, Steve Bruce, and his work, basically trying to say, actually, this idea that we had of secularization was correct. We just got the timing wrong, which brings us to, his piece, Late Secularization or Religion as Alien, where he basically says, the inherited model holds up. It just started much later than we thought. We really didn't get true secularization really until the middle part of the 20th century, after which, basically when secularization took hold of a country, each generation was about half as religious as the last. And he basically then goes into, kind of reasons that he thinks, this is true secularization now, and we're not going to see any kind of rebound in religion whatsoever. The first kind of part of this he calls declining stocks of knowledge, right? And this is where we ended off last time. He said, in the past, right, there were these moments, say, when it looked like religion maybe was on the back foot, right? That people were becoming less religious, attendance at church services was down, into the beginning part of the 19th century. And so we could, people thought, yeah, this is it. This is secularization. Religion is going away. But then, American and British societies went through these moments called the Great Revivals, right? Where these passionate, charismatic preachers went around and kind of drummed up religious energy again, and reactivated religion, so that by, the beginning of the 20th century, religion, what is that? Something of a high ebb, right? That a lot of people were attending religious services, and religious intensity was very high in Britain and very high in the United States. Okay, but what Bruce, I almost called him Stark. That would have landed me in sociology of religion hell. Um, what Bruce says is now that we've gotten to this period where, it's declining generation by generation, it has been since roughly the middle part of the 20th century, now there's a few things working against a possible religious revival. And the one we talked about last time was declines in religious knowledge, right? Or declining stocks of knowledge. And what Bruce is basically saying, right, is that, in the past, even though people might have been secularizing, they were still in a society that was sort of suffused by religion. In the case of Britain and in Western Europe, right, we're talking about Christianity. Everybody would have essentially known the basic stories, right? They would have known the basic narrative of Christianity. They would have known who the major figures were. So there was something to work with for, these revivalists to come and sort of reactivate religious sentiment. But that really has kind of passed away, right? People aren't being, taught in school anymore, the Bible. And so they don't know kind of even basic Christian doctrines, right? And he says that, anyone under 60 in the UK basically has almost no knowledge of kind of Christianity, basic Christian doctrine, or anything like that. And, it doesn't look like there's any reason for it to come back. And, they've been now through, a bunch of kind of shocks. There's been the shocks of the 20th century, financial shocks, wars, and all this. And, really, religion hasn't kind of emerged in Western Europe. It's continued its kind of steady decline. But from which he draws the conclusion, right, that since the UK and Europe have been secular now for almost 2 generations, if people can get by with no religion, or with little or no religion, then being religious is clearly not part of the basic human condition. It's a social product that comes out of certain social conditions, right? Now, that's a claim, Bruce is obviously making a particular kind of claim here, right? That religion is, because a lot of people will suggest that because most societies have had a religion, right, that religion is and being religious is somehow inherent to the human condition. And what Bruce is making the argument here is that no, actually, if we can have 2 generations of Westerners kind of getting by without religion, then clearly religion is just a special product and not something inherent to human beings. Now, this is a claim that I somewhat disagree with. I think that, Bruce is being a little bit intemperate here. And I would suggest, like Smith does at the end of his book on religion, that, human beings aren't necessarily religious. They all have religious potential. Whether that potential gets activated or not, I think is a question. So I think, this is pure Professor Broussard opinion. I think Bruce is going a little bit too far there. Because I do think, anyone has the potential at any moment to become religious if the conditions are right. So saying that it's just a social product, I think is going a step too far. But that's opinion, right? Okay, so social influence in religious conversion. So one of the things that Bruce notes, and I think this is actually quite correct, and when we get to talking about the nuns later on in the course, I think this is what so NONES, not NUNS, or those who identify as nothing in particular with regards to religion. I think, Bruce's point here is actually well put. And this is the idea that he says that marginal religious people are shrinking as a percentage of the population, leaving, kind of 2 camps, the very religious and unreligious people. Okay, so I think this is basically correct, right? That what used to be the case is that, even if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, the baby boomer generation, and I still see this when I look at the statistics, right? And they do like the general social survey in Canada and the US, and you see the kind of, if you look at, say, the boomers and you look at their religious identification, it's quite high. And in a lot of cases, their actual religious participation is quite low. So what you used to have, right, were people that were not very religious. We would have called them marginally religious, but they maintained a religious identity, right? So that, I always think of this journalist named Rod Dreher, and he tells kind of the story of his family in rural Louisiana, right? And, eventually he converted to Catholicism, But his family were Methodists. Now, by his family's own admission, they never actually went to church, right? They were Christmas and Easter Methodists, if that, but they were Methodists like down to their core. And so when he converted to Catholicism, this caused a big row in his family because his family were essentially marginal Methodists, right? They were, they had a religious identity, but it was more or less kind of inactive. It was there, but it also allowed something kind of interesting. A lot of social consents. Interesting. Yes, I haven't charged my laptop in 3 days, and the battery on it tends to be so good that sometimes I just forget that it needs power. I've just been running around. At least in this class. In some past classes, I forgot to bring a charger, and I'm like, does anyone have a Surface? But I'm good. All right. I will fix you, computer. If I can find the slot. Ta-da. All fixed. Okay. Yeah, please. Well, I mean, if someone asks you, what is your religious affiliation? And you're like, well, I'm an Anglican or I'm Roman Catholic. You can say that and mean it sincerely without necessarily attending religious services, right? And that would put you, like, you're saying you have a religious identity, that you belong to this particular group, but you don't go, right? Yeah, please.
So basically we're seeing a decline in people who are just middle of the road, like, I'm religious, but I don't really actively practice.
Precisely, yeah.
So the participation levels haven't really changed, it's just the people identifying.
I think that's a reasonable theory, and when we get to the nuns, we'll kind of look at a lot of different kind of understandings of what this looks like. But yeah, essentially, let me think. Who am I thinking of? Both Philip Jenkins, who's at Baylor, and Glenn Stanton, who's a kind of in-house sociologist at Focus on the Family, both kind of make the case that what we're seeing with the phenomenon of those who identify as nothing in particular is more people who are marginal. Now there's no kind of social pressure to identify as religious in some way. And so they're moving into that category of no religion, right? But they were always kind of no religion-ish. Like they didn't really go. Yeah.
So the percentage of religious people was artificially inflated by people, like marginal people claiming to be religious, but I guess religious participation was artificially.
Yeah, I think the perception that, say, the whole society was, say, Christian or whatever, right, was probably inflated by the fact that there was a lot of marginal participation, right? A lot of people who were not that committed to it, probably not that interested in it, but held a religious identity because it was sort of expected, right? You were something, right? If your grandparents were Methodists, you were Methodist. If your grandparents were Anglicans, you were an Anglican. If your grandparents were, or your parents were Catholic, you were Catholic, whether you attended very much or not. And it's only kind of in later generations that people have kind of stopped identifying at all. Sorry, I know it's a controversial claim maybe, but I think it's right? And basically what Bruce is saying is that there was a lot of kind of marginal people, and that increasingly those people are moving either into the very religious camp or more likely into the non-religious camp, leaving kind of society, and maybe you can believe this, very polarized in kind of religious terms between, religious, very religious, and unreligious on the other side. Now, I mean, in a sense, what people will claim is that big population of people who are marginally religious gave the very religious a lot of political and social capital, right? Because they could kind of activate those people who were marginally on their side towards whatever causes they were interested in, whether that's like the great anti-communist struggles, of the 20th century, right? We're all Christians here, right? We need to, gather against Ivan and his atheist hordes from the Soviet Union, or whatever, right? That there was this big marginal population and gave a lot of power socially and politically to people who were very religious, right? But yeah, I mean, increasingly what Bruce is saying is that it's splitting into kind of those two poles. Now, and as we'll see this when we talk about the book The Rise of Christianity from Rodney Stark, and we'll deal in great detail with how this actually works and how the social aspects of conversion actually work. But Stark notes, and I think this is correct, although I will say Bruce. Okay, let me tell you what Stark says, and I'll tell you what Bruce is doing, because it's kind of funny. What Stark notes basically is that religious conversion has a lot more to do with social connection than it does with beliefs, right? People move into religious categories typically because of kind of the social environment around them. So that, conversion to a religious group usually follows kind of backwards from what we tend to think. You belong, you behave, and then you believe, typically, rather than, belief being kind of primary. So if there isn't a large base of religious people around you, it's unlikely that people can be swayed to religion, because there aren't going to be the social ties that pull you into a kind of deeper religious faith or religious faith at all, right? If religion exists on the kind of polar edge of a society, it's just not going to be big enough to draw in a lot of new people or activate kind of inactive people religiously. So, and adult conversions are somewhat rare, right? If someone enters adulthood with no religion, the chances that they're going to become religious are relatively small, right? Somewhere around, fewer than probably 10% of people who identify as non-religious in their 20s are going to convert later on in life. Bruce says 5%. I think it's actually a little bit higher than that. But nevertheless, I think the point kind of stands. And so here, Bruce, I think, because I cited this because I think it's funny. Bruce cites the diffusion of innovation research and work on religious conversion shows that people are more likely to entertain some new idea or practical innovation when it's presented to them either by friends or people who are similar to themselves, the same race, class, and same gender. He's citing this, which is a totally weird thing, diffusion of innovation research. What he really should be citing is Rodney Stark, because Stark and Laughlin worked on this in their work on both Mormonism and the Moonies in the 1960s and 70s, and Rodney Stark kind of wrote the book on religious conversion in lots of ways, but they hate each other, so he found a different literature to cite that he thought was better. Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering, so in that 5% or a little bit more, were there any common factors between the adults that converted later in life?
Well, okay. Yes and no. There's a common pattern to how it proceeds, but I'd like to save that for later, because it usually, proceeds in a very particular kind of way. People tend, if they're a little bit more, more women than men, somewhat a little bit more socially isolated. If they've gone through a kind of transitional moment in life, that helps. But it's often, just about who they connect with at a particular moment in life. So there's no hard and fast rule, but there's a few that you can kind of talk about. Okay, are we good with this slide? Okay. Why do I always scream when I see these? What would the argument be with modernity when people get more religious after that was a question from last time that I didn't answer. Okay, so more religious after tragedies, there's a couple of ways that this kind of works out, right? It's like you can make a sort of Peter Berger sort of argument, which I think makes sense, right? That the mundane and the ordinary sometimes gets punctuated by particular moments, right? Where you have, death especially, right? A tragedy or some kind of large scale social disruption that happens, right? 9/11 is the famous case, right? Where right after 9/11, church attendance jumped up really quite acutely. Now, these aren't always very durable, right? Sometimes it's just people looking for answer, and that particular moment of crisis pushes them into considering things they don't think about on an everyday basis, right? When you're faced with death, and especially in Western societies where in a lot of ways death is a very remote thing that happens a long time from now, in a galaxy far, far away, or at very least in a hospital. We're not faced with death on a kind of daily basis. At least not, face to face. Maybe we see it through Twitter or something, but not. That question is so inappropriate. You're getting ahead of me. But yeah, basically, there are going to be moments where people, a secular explanation might be exhausted by circumstances, and people might then look to religion. Is it durable? I don't know that it always is. It may be sometimes, but like the spike in church attendance after 9/11 was a very temporary sort of thing, right? After that moment had passed, it sort of slipped away as well. So what does he mean by social product? So he means that religion is just a product of, like it's socially constructed, right? It's a product of society and of particular needs that that society has in a given moment. If those needs change, then religion might disappear altogether. And that's the case he's making with Western Europe. It's like Western Europe doesn't need religion anymore, right? It is wealthy, it is relatively safe, it has meaning in other places, in scientific rationality. And so that society produces a society with no religion, because whatever caused religion to be needed in a previous European society, that moment has now kind of passed away. How does moralistic, okay, A, you got the term wrong. Moralistic therapeutic deism fit with secularization? I don't know that Smith ever says so. This is a concept from Christian Smith, The National Study of Youth and Religion. Obviously, someone took sociology of religion or one of my other religion classes and has seen this term before. MTD, I think would be along the kind of line of secularization, but in one where, the pluralism of society means that religion kind of gets dissolved into society so that you go from particular religious doctrines to, kind of a mushy moralism that can be shared by everybody, whatever their religion happens to be. But we'll talk about MTD later in the course. No previews. Okay. Just making sure I've got the slides in the right order. Right, okay. What Bruce says too is that religion is now alien. And by this he means that it comes from people, so in the UK, he's thinking of the UK example in particular, it comes from people who are no longer like the average person, right? So it's alien to most people's experiences, right? It's othered, right? It doesn't, when they do encounter it, it is not from people who are like them. So what he says is it is elderly, right? So the people who remain religious in Britain today, according to Bruce, are elderly. They probably live in a rural setting, right? If you go to London, the church attendance rate on a weekly basis is something like 5-10% at most. So, the vast majority of people don't go to church. It is foreign in a couple of ways, right? If it's Catholic, there's a good chance that it's a lot of Polish workers who have come from Poland, once Poland was admitted into the EU, to work in Britain. I know Britain is now no longer part of the EU, but there's still a lot of migrant workers. They're Polish, bringing their Catholicism. It's African, right? So both Catholic, so this is a Catholic mass in Britain, right? The bishop is white. All the congregants are African. Or in a lot of cases now, it's either an African indigenized form of Christianity or a form of kind of Pentecostalism that was introduced in the middle part of the 20th century into Africa. Pentecostalism is a Christian sect. It was introduced into Africa middle part of the 20th century, and then from there sort of has spread back through immigration into Britain. It's a very different form of Christianity, and one that, for like British sensibilities that might be used to thinking of church as Anglicanism, right? Robes and hymns and the Queen and all that would seem very different with, speaking in tongues and drumming and all, music and sermons that kind of are all like not all over the place, but kind of, that may not be the 9-minute sermon that's prescribed by the Church of England. Or increasingly Muslim, right? Increasingly the people who are religious in the UK might be Muslim, typically from either North Africa, right, where Britain used to have colonies, or from Pakistan, and other parts of the former British Empire and the British Commonwealth where they're now coming. So, it's different. It's not like, white Steve Bruce, or I guess Bruce in Aberdeen, who's white and British and has been for generations, right? It looks kind of foreign. Often segregated in terms of housing and interaction, right? There are particular areas that are kind of where people move into and keep these communities going. So it's something that people everyday Britons might not encounter a lot, right? Because, that community is over there kind of keeping to itself. And so for Bruce, if everything is sort of if religion spreads socially, if your most religious people are all kind of alien and not interacting with the bulk of the population, or not recognizable to them, those social interactions are hard to form. Yeah, please.
Would this kind of fall into strictness theory, because if they're all kind of living in the same area, it kind of deters free riders?
It might almost be closer to like sheltered enclave theory, where they're like gathering together in kind of ethnically based enclaves. Like they may not be strict, right? There may actually be a lot of free riders in some of these communities. Their actual religious intensity is something that I'm not sure. I'm trying to think, because I can think of a few big Pentecostal churches in the UK, but some of them are like mega churches, and mega churches are often a little bit hard to like manifest real strictness in. Yeah, please.
Is this true outside of the British context?
I mean, probably less so. I mean, for Canada and the US, they're a little bit more integrated. Okay, so I'll say this. Definitely in Western Europe, right? What you'll see in Western Europe, like say if you went to Belgium, is they have some really, like or in France, in the banlieue, right, in the suburbs, you've had some really intense kind of religious communities be born and be imported from places like Africa. But they exist in kind of this space away from kind of native Belgians and the French, right, and the metropolitan kind of countries. So I think in Europe it's more true. I think in Canada and the US, maybe a little bit less so. Yeah, please.
Is Canada and the US more religious than Europe?
Okay, the US is very much more religious than Europe. And Canada is somewhat more religious than Europe. It's kind of on a pretty sharp decline, but it is still much, like a fair bit more religious than Europe. Yeah. And driven by a whole bunch of things. We'll talk about it. I got a whole bunch of slides on religious landscape coming up later in the course. You'll get all your questions answered-ish, maybe. There's only so much we can explain. Okay, are we good? Okay. Yes, the public reputation of religion. One of the things that Bruce says, and I think this is probably pretty true, because he says, most people don't know anything about religion. Actual kind of like religious beliefs are caricatured. And one of the things he suggests, right, is that, people think that religion is mostly about being nice and a good person. And religion is about a lot more than that. Obviously, there's a lot of rules, right? There's a lot of systems that are built into religion. It may be about ideas of living a good life, but it's not always the case that religion is just about making you a good person. So there's been this almost like, what he's reflecting here is basically that starting kind of like in the 18th century, you have this kind of, is Kant the 18th? I think Kant is the 18th century. You have Immanuel Kant, right, the philosopher. And what Kant sort of does philosophically is he equates religion with a system of ethics, right? And he says that basically religion is just a system of ethics whose ethics could be arrived at from a secular rationalist basis as well. And so everything, people start to see religion very much as kind of reduced to a system of ethics, right? So how to get along with people, how to be kind. And over time, essentially this sort of wears on the public consciousness so that people, and as people lose a kind of real connection with religions, people start to think that, it's just about being nice, kind, and good. And probably, and we'll talk about MTD later in the course, moralistic therapeutic deism is this term that Christian Smith comes up with to talk about how millennials kind of manifest their religion. And it is a lot about, being a nice, good, and kind person. And so people have come to this kind of understanding of, what it should mean to be Christian or Muslim or whatever, and it should be, essentially being kind to everybody, just following the golden rule, even though, of course, religious systems are much, much more complex than that, right? So people, anything that's more doctrinal than that, is condemned as somehow not Christian, right? People will often kind of judge or criticize, Christians for being judgmental, even though, Jesus apparently wasn't judgmental at all, or at least that's the kind of pop impression of Jesus. And the same thing with Muslims, right? That basically it should be a religion of peace, so why are all these non-peaceful things in the religion? Of course, religions are much more complex than these kind of caricatures. So yeah, people often accuse Catholics and evangelicals of being mean and cruel for opposing things like same-sex marriage, abortion, or whatever, right? Whatever the cause célèbre of the day is, without really bothering to understand what those religions teach and why they have particular objections to, things that otherwise other people in society feel are okay, right? And yeah, the other thing is obviously prominent moments where religion kind of has popped into people's consciousness have often been about, people who are ostensibly religious, doing terrible things. Probably September the 11th, of 2001, and the kind of Muslim violence since then that kind of is sometimes the only thing people really hear about Muslims, has, he says, damaged the reputation of all religions, right? So, and this is kind of true. What happens after September the 11th is the public kind of opinion of, whether religion is good or bad for society shifts hard towards, it's more harmful to society than not. And it takes a little while, but now, I think we're in the moment where a fair either plurality or majority of people think that religion probably does more harm than good, right? So yeah, in a largely secular society, trouble created by people claiming religious justification is blamed not on the specific religion, but on religion in general. And you can think of people like Richard Dawkins, right? And, what's his name? The stupid British drunk guy. Chris Hitchens, or Christopher Hitchens. I shouldn't demean his memory, but reading his book, God is Not Great, is an adventure in following a drunken man as he shambles around his house and yells at the curtains, because it's basically incoherent. But maybe I'm being too generous. It's not. I don't know. I have a friend who absolutely loves this book, and I've tried to read it like 10 times, and I'm like, this book doesn't even make any sense. There's a chapter about pigs. It's kind of nice, I guess. Anyway, I am not a big fan of Hitchens, but Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris, right, and these kind of, Peter Boghossian and this gang of new atheists, really kind of harped on this idea that religion in general was harmful, right? Richard Dawkins called, The God Delusion is his favorite book. Like, it's a delusion, and it makes people do bad things, and
could we argue that because, like, even practitioners of certain religions don't know as much as they used to in the prior years, so you could have someone who has less progressive ideology who wants to make it known that they have less progressive ideology, so they kind of just pick and choose from the religion
caricature?
Caricature, yes. And they're kind of perpetuating the stereotype too, if people are reacting to that, because for lack of better words, the stupid ones are always the loudest ones.
I see you've been on Catholic Twitter. I'm just kidding. This is like the story of Catholic Twitter. Kind of, there's particular figures that I could point to. You can come and take my class on Catholicism and pop culture and find out all about them. Though you will regret it because they're vile. Like Taylor Marshall, Dr. Taylor Marshall. Okay, I should say, I got into a lot of trouble for criticizing these people at one point. I did a presentation on Catholic Twitter like 3 years ago, and it was like 2 weeks of really conservative Catholics lambasting me for apparently being gay, which I think is funny. Because, anyone who criticizes super conservative Catholics must be gay. An academic that no one's ever heard of, which is true, but who cares? Having a slight lisp, which apparently also makes me gay, I guess. And not understanding basic vocabulary. Like I called some of them muckrakers, which is a journalistic term for people who dig up dirt on other people, which they are. And I'm like, this is the definition. What did I get wrong? And they're like, I don't know. But, there were some angry emails and people saying they were going to blow up the Catholic college on campus for me working there, which I didn't. I was just a guest speaker there. Anyway, I say, if Dr. Taylor Marshall's fans find this on YouTube, I'm sorry. Don't send me death threats again. Anyway, yeah, Dr. Taylor Marshall. And like Michael Voris, who hilariously, he's like a media figure on the Catholic far right. And he puts his credentials. He's like, Michael Voris, STB. And I'm like, what is an STB? It's a bachelor's degree. I'm like, don't put your bachelor's degree in your like signature. Come on, guy. Like, that's not cool. Don't do that, by the way. Don't be out in the world and be like, I am, I'm Jeff Broussard, BA. It's like, no one cares, guys. Everyone has a BA. Okay, anyway, I got distracted. Yes, the public reputation of religion. Yeah, there's certainly like bad actors who then get a lot of attention because equally people who are looking for, to prove that religion is bad will always point to the possibly worst actors and the people who are being just as caricature-y at the same time. I'm sorry, I got lost in a fugue state of hating the Catholic right. They bug me a lot. Okay. Othering, right. I'm still in the fugue state. It's also Friday. Okay, I also woke up at 5 a.m. this morning. I was like, I need to do work. And I was like, no.
Also Friday the 13th.
Ooh, spooky. Or is it? Well, we'll see. If something bad happens, then I'll know that I cursed myself by saying, is it? All right, so othering. Yeah, when you have only caricatures of religion, and maybe you're kind of alluding to this is what happens. You read ahead in the notes and you get ahead of me. With only those caricatures of religion available, people often will see, religious people as kind of sub-rational, discriminatory, or in some way inferior, especially to these broadly shared kind of secular values. And so, right, you get, you don't have to really, I'll say, you don't have to go very far to find those kinds of attitudes, right? I think if you go to Reddit, which I don't recommend ever for anything, r/atheist, you'll find, basically people who will make this claim. Anything that starts with, people need their sky daddy or tooth fairy or whatever. I'm like, okay, we've entered into the world of the sub-rational criticizing people for being sub-rational. Anyway, don't go to r/atheist. It's a hive of scum and villainy. And in fact, don't go to Reddit at all. It's also a hive of scum and villainy. But yeah, you don't have to go very far, right? But there's this sense that it's now possible to other religious people, to caricature them as these mindless bigots, which in some cases is true and other cases is not. But if that's the reputation that religion has, right, it's pretty hard to make a case for, a religion to revive when its values are so caricatured and its image is so othered in the society that even the thought of joining a religion would probably elicit kind of strange looks in polite society, right? Like if you were amongst your secular friends to say that you had converted to Mormonism, you would probably get some strange looks, right? Unless, of course, you're in a world where there's a lot of Mormons, is people would be like, yeah, but what? Did you move to Lethbridge? What happened? No, I'm kidding. Okay. And yeah, basically, David Bentley Hart, who, if you're looking for a verbose insulter, you will find none better than David Bentley Hart. However, as I've learned, at some point, you may enjoy him criticizing the people you don't like, but eventually, for some reason, his ire always turns on the people you do like as well. And then you have to deal with his verbose insults, which is not that much fun. But he's a brilliant philosopher. David is absolutely brilliant. Basically, he says, we're in this position where, since people don't really understand what Christian doctrine is, the society just is defining itself as post-Christian. So whatever it sees as Christian, it has essentially rejected. And so he thinks it's basically impossible for Western society to be re-evangelized or a revival to happen because, the society has so positioned itself as, whatever comes after Christian or having rejected, the bounds of kind of religion. And I think that makes sense. Why did the screen go black? Okay, it's back. Okay. Cool. Have a good Friday. All right. So that's Bruce in a nutshell. All right. So now let's go and take a look at the opposite position. And this from a piece called Secularization, Rest in Peace. My very dramatic tombstone for secularization. Okay. So this is probably one of the most fun pieces to read, actually. If you're a sociology of religion dork, as I am, this is actually a really fun piece because this is Rodney Stark, my favorite sociologist and yours, I hope, taking a victory lap. So what happens, right? All right. As I said earlier in the course, right, up until really the 1990s, there had been this pretty strong consensus in sociology of religion that secularization and this inherited model of secularization was essentially correct, right? That whatever happened, society was going to get more modern and secularization was going to take hold and religion would be dead. And I've told you about Peter Berger's famous prediction, right, that by the year 2000, the few religious people that remained on earth would be huddled together in isolated communities, sheltering themselves from the oncoming of a global secular order. Now, Peter Berger lived long enough to eat those words. So he renounces secularization theory in 1997, right? And this is a quote from Peter Berger, right? I think what I and most other sociologists of religion wrote in the 1960s about secularization was a mistake. Our underlying argument was that secularization and modernity go hand in hand. With more modernization comes more secularization. And what is pretty apparent, I think, by the late 90s is that these predictions were wrong, right? The world of the 1990s is still a very religious place. And so Berger, renounces this view officially. He writes some papers about it. And in 2000, right, so to mark the anniversary of Peter Berger's prediction being wrong, Rodney Stark writes this article called RIP Secularization, basically as a victory lap, because the one group of sociologists of religion who had been arguing against the secularization theory was basically Rodney Stark and all of Rodney Stark's friends. And Stark had long been arguing that this theory was incorrect. And so he takes it as, the culmination of this long-running battle in the field, and a way to trumpet that he was right all along. And if anything, Rodney Stark loves reminding people that he was right all along, because, big egos. So basically what he will argue in this piece is that the theory of secularization, this inherited model, was incorrect, and that it should simply be abandoned and put in its grave already, once and for all. So, to start the piece, he basically, I got 6 minutes left, okay. He basically goes back in kind of Western philosophical history and traces the roots of this secularization thesis back to the end of the 17th century, right? So the 1600s. Specifically, Thomas Woolston, who basically predicted that Christianity would be gone as a result of modernization by 1900. Thomas Jefferson, right, the American president and founding father of the United States, who was a Unitarian, a Universalist, so he thought there was maybe a God, but not the God of Christianity, certainly. And Jefferson is famous for having, taken the Bible and cut out all of the passages that referred to the supernatural, and then said, okay, this is what we should keep, which I presume was not that much. It said that, in 1822, right, he predicted that within his lifetime, Christianity would fade away. Peter Berger predicted in 1968, in the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects huddled together to resist a worldwide secular order. And so on and so forth, right? 3 centuries of predictions that religion was gone, and yet, as Stark notes, religion persists in the West. Okay, so 5 things that basically Stark says are common to secularization theory. that he disagrees with. One, basically, secularization thesis believers are in universal agreement that modernization, is the causal engine dragging the gods into retirement. He has such a great turn of phrase. I love him. No, don't worry. It gets better because we're going to do Rise of Christianity after, and I love that book even more than this. So you're in for a Stark love fest for the next couple weeks. So basically, that it's not merely directed towards institutional differentiation, separation of church and state, but basically also has to do with individual piety, right? So it's not just like, society on a macro level will become more secular, but also people will stop believing in religion because they don't need to, right? That's definitely inherent in the inherited model of secularization. Now, Stark, there's another school of thought, which I'll talk about after secularization, rest in peace, which is called the revised secularization or neo-secularization theory. And Stark is also arguing against that, right? He's like, okay, some of the neo-secularization guys will be like, yeah, okay, well, it's just about religious authority declining, but not about individual religion going away. And Stark's like, nah, you all believe that as that happens, individual piety will decrease as well. And this is, he says that the proponents of secularization, in an effort to keep this theory that they so love around, have kept moving the goalposts, right? Basically since the 1980s, right? So it's like, well, when we said secularization, what we really meant was, differentiation. And he's like, no, that's not what any of you mean. And I think he's basically correct in that. Science has a deadly implication for religion, that science and religion cannot coexist. And this is the toothpaste never goes back in the tube argument that, again, Stark disagrees with, that secularization is irreversible, right? Once a society loses that religious impulse, you can't go back. You can't put the toothpaste of religion back, or of secularization back into the tube. And this one, that it's not merely a Western phenomenon, but rather it should take place globally as well. So as modernity spreads its tentacles out into the world, it should, Hindus should become less religious. Mormons, Muslims should become less religious. All of these things should happen. And these are all things that Stark disagrees with, which I'm going to say is probably here, I'll give you a preview of what we're going to talk about next time, and then we'll leave it there. I think his most provocative claim in the piece is that there hasn't really been a significant decline in European religiosity. He'll say religious participation was very low in Northern and Western Europe for many centuries before modernity, and what we're seeing is just a continuation of that low ebb of European religion, right? But levels of subjective religiousness remain high, and to classify a nation as secularized when the large majority of its inhabitants believe in God is an odd position. So I'll leave it there for today, and we'll unpack these claims of Stark's. Especially the top one is really important to his argument, but we'll unpack it next time.